I'm gonna have to jump. for getting me set up. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to wait on a couple more commissioners to join us and we'll start shortly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Commissioners, I am now going to turn on your ability to start your video and audio.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to see you. Good to be able to get back together. Let's call February 11th, 2021 meeting of the Little Hoover Commission to order. This is our public hearing on law enforcement training. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm chairman of the Little Hoover Commission, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to introduce the other commissioners who are with us on Zoom. I believe Commissioner Aroner will be joining us. Present is Commissioner Beyer, Cynthia Buisa, Bill Emerson, Kathy Schwamberger, and Janet Sidley. We also have legislative members of our commission present, the Honorable Senator Jim Nielsen and the also Honorable Senator Bill Quirk. Thank you for joining us. Also are the commission staff. We have our executive director, Ethan Rarick, deputy executive director, Tamar Foster, project managers, Crystal Beckham and Tristan Stein, and analyst Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping before we turn to the subject. The commissioner's audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when they speak. Members of the public will be muted during the, as is standard for the commission, we will have a public comment session at the end. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during the public comment session at the end of our hearing. If you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join the public comment queue. There will be those who have joined us by phone. You may send an email to littlehoover@lat.ca.gov letting us know that you want to address us. You must provide the phone number in which you have joined the meeting so that staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment throughout the duration of our hearing. As is usual at commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube channel and Facebook page. Now on to the substance of today's hearing. This is the first of 3 commission hearings on law enforcement training. Today's hearing will focus on the role of the commission on peace officer standards and training, known as the Post Commission, in setting minimum training standards. We will also explore opportunities to ensure California peace officers receive adequate and appropriate training support. Momentum for police reform accelerated spring in the way of devastating news of multiple police-involved killings of Black Americans through excessive use of force. These deadly police encounters spurred widespread protests in California and across the U.S., as well as calls for a fundamental change in policing. In response, state lawmakers have looked at training as one means to implement law enforcement reform. By many accounts, California is ahead of many other states in introducing various police reforms. But in many areas, particularly law enforcement training, little evidence is available to demonstrate what actually works and what does not. While most law enforcement functions are principally conducted by local governments, the state's primary connection to law enforcement is through the training standards developed by the Post Commission. The Post Commission has an important role in implementing legislative training mandates and generally developing and overseeing training standards for the nearly 700 law enforcement agencies in the state. Today, we'll hear about the role of the Post Commission in shaping California law enforcement training, the role of the legislature in influencing law enforcement training priorities, and how research can be used to drive police training reforms. In the next month, we will hold 2 additional hearings examining California law enforcement training. The hearing was organized by Tamar Foster. And I also want to acknowledge Assemblymember Quirk, when during a business meeting when we were discussing the issue of policing, very clear in identifying the role of police and recommend that be the direction that we take insofar as how we examine police training and conduct. Let me ask Tamar, again, our Deputy Executive Director, to introduce the first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first witness this morning is Mr. Manny Alvarez. He was appointed as the Executive Director of the Post Commission in July 2016. Previously, he served as Special Agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 26 years, where he held several assignments throughout California and abroad. Good morning, Mr. Alvarez.
Good morning.
Morning, welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak before your commission. I greatly appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the meeting. As Ms. Foster mentioned, my name is Manny Alvarez. I currently serve as the Executive Director at Post. Post is a state agency made up of 135 personnel. Our primary focus is kind of twofold: is one, to set and enforce hiring standards for peace officers and public safety dispatchers, And then the other primary role, which is what we're here for today, is setting training standards and enforcing those training standards across the state for both peace officers and dispatchers. There are approximately 611 agencies or departments that currently voluntarily participate in the POST program across the state of California. And we serve approximately 84,000 full-time peace officers across the state, where there are 84,000 full-time peace officers. We obviously serve part-timers and reserves as well. And there's approximately 8,000 public safety dispatchers that also fall under the public safety or under the POST program. So I'd like to just break up my presentation in terms of training into two parts. First, basic training, and then in-service training for existing officers. So basic training for peace officers consists of two different programs. There is the Basic Academy, which we all kind of describe as the police academy, and then there is the field training program. The Basic Academy is set by the POST Commission, the minimum training standards. There are some legislative requirements that are also thrown into the Basic Academy, but the minimum content for the Basic Academy is 664 hours across the state. There's 41 police academies across the state. We certify all of their training, and we audit them to ensure that they're complying with our training standards every 3 years. Although the average is the minimum content is 664 hours. Departments and academies, community colleges are allowed to add training content above and beyond the 664 hours. And the average right now is approximately 800 hours for the Basic Police Academy. I think the lowest number of hours at one academy is approximately 700 hours, and the most is 1,450 hours. Once an individual completes the Basic Academy, they go into a mandated field training program upon successful completion of the academy. That also is a standardized curriculum set by POST. The minimum training on that is 10 weeks. However, the average in the state of California is somewhere between 16 to 18 weeks. So from start to finish for a peace officer, the program usually takes about 1 year to accomplish. Aside from that, they have to complete their training, they have to complete field training, and they have to successfully complete probation within 2 years to obtain their basic certificate. The California Penal Code requires them to have a basic certificate within 2 years of completion. For dispatchers, it's a little different. Public safety dispatchers are required to go through a 120-hour training course within their first year of employment. Some go through the training before, some have in-house training, and then they go to the 120-hour training course. That is what happens for basic training for those individuals. Aside from that, there is in-service training that they must complete throughout their career. And again, that is set by the POST Commission, and it's also set by the legislature. There are a number of different mandates that they have to hit throughout their career. The minimum required training by the POST Commission is 24 hours of training every 2 years, 14 of which are set by the POST Commission that they have to hit in 4 different programs. That on top of that are the ledge mandates that I'll talk about here at the very end for both in-service and Basic Academy. So although the training requirements are only 24 hours every 2 years, if you add up the total number of hours that are trained in California, which usually equate to about 4 million training hours a year, divided by the 90,000, it kind of hits the mark of about 40 some hours of training per individual per year that they receive of post-certified training. We have a total of 4,600 training courses across the state of California that are currently post-certified training courses. The vast majority of those are developed by departments and community colleges and independent or private presenters that bring those before the POST Commission for review and certification. Those courses are reviewed by POST staff every 2 years to ensure that they are compliant with current law and contemporary. And then we also have a funding scheme in terms of how we prioritize or how we incentivize in terms of funding our training courses, and that is published and on our website. I would like to just kind of run through it for you just very, very quickly to give you an idea what that looks like. So the highest priority for us is, I can pull it up 1 second here.
While you're doing that, this is Pedro. I see Ms. Sidley, you're unmuted. Do you want to make a comment? And let me explain to Mr. Alvarez, while in most settings being interrupted is rude, it actually is a compliment with the Little Hoover Commission because it means that commissioners have latched onto something and they want to bring it to your attention. And I'm thinking that's what Commissioner Sidley's doing.
So, Mr. Alvarez, thank you very much for testifying with us today. And you're actually headed right into the path of where my questions were. So I'm just going to put this out here and hope that as you go through this discussion, you can touch on how is the training paid for? So if I am a small rural police force versus LAPD, is this covered through post, or do they have to contribute? And if so, what's that formula to pay for this training? And also I'd like to know, when you're talking about how it's reviewed by, programs are reviewed by post staff to make sure that it remains compliant, et cetera. If you could delve a little bit more into what that involves. Is there outside input? Is there a panel that looks at this, and how that curriculum is ultimately developed, decided upon? I understand clearly you've indicated much of it is statutory, but if there's other pieces to this that are not statutory or whatever, what is the process that post goes through in order to develop your curriculum?
Okay, I will address both of those.
Terrific.
So to start with the first one, how we pay for and how we incentivize training is not something simple to describe unless you live in the post world, but training is delivered in two different, or is paid for in two different manners by post. Some is done on a training contract basis. So approximately $20 million of the $80 million post budget goes out to training contracts. We develop the curriculum, and then we send that out to community colleges, police departments across the state of California, and we pay for them to teach that curriculum if they're certified to teach it. So I'll give you an example. We have probably one of our more popular courses is something we call the Supervisor Leadership Institute. It's an 8-month training course that's delivered on a contract basis through CSU Long Beach. We also have a series of detective courses: homicide, robbery, sex assaults, domestic violence. That also is delivered on a contract basis through community colleges, departments like San Francisco Police Department, LAPD. Students show up to that course. They don't have to pay anything. It's paid for directly by post. Aside from training contracts, departments can petition post through a training reimbursement request process to get reimbursed for their travel, their food, lodging, and tuition if they are charged tuition for certain courses that are post-certified and fall within a scheme. So if the reimbursement schema is online, and that's what I was going to address now. So to give you an idea, the highest priority funding for us currently, at least as of January 2020, federal funding allocated by federal law, funding for through Violence Against Women Act, prioritized on the direction of the legislature and the governor, as well as legislative and post mandates, such as use of force, mental health, de-escalation, cultural diversity, and active shooter. Those are the #1 priorities right now in terms of reimbursement. That scheme, if you look at it, or that schema, if you look at it, goes down 6 or 7 tiers. So what happens is, if you are a police department, let's say you're the Chico Police Department, and you have a course that you want to put together on mental health training, we will assign one of these reimbursement plans to it. So if the Reading Police Department wants to send officers down to take the Chico PD course, they will get reimbursed by post, and perhaps, depending on what plan is assigned to it, Chico Police Department may get reimbursed as well for putting on the training. So it's twofold.
I apologize. I'm gonna interrupt you. I have two commissioners that are unmuted, Senator Nielsen and then Commissioner Byer.
Okay.
Jim, you just muted yourself. Senator, unmute. You're muted. I'm sorry.
There we go.
Thank you.
So that's how the funding works.
No,
Right
wait.
now, I'm
I'm
sorry.
gonna interrupt you again. Now, Senator Nielsen, did you want to make a comment at this point?
No, I did not, Mr. Chairman.
My apologies. All right, Commissioner Byer, did you?
Yes, thank you very much for your service and those of your fellow peace officers. As the oldest 1959 post and the largest in the state that offers the most courses and the longest training period, it's impressive work. So I have an uncomfortable question for you. If you could help us understand two questions, and I think they're interrelated. One, the difference between non-stress training and stress training, and the claim that's made by some that there is insufficient scientific evidence for many common police practices. And I'll use an example, the so-called 21-foot rule. So how, as a host, are you able to accommodate these different styles, the stress style versus non-stress? Explain that. And then how do you deal with the presence or absence of scientific evidence to substantiate the training predicate and outcomes?
In terms of stress versus non-stress academies, Post historically has not taken a stance. There's no regulation which dictates whether an academy should be a stress academy or a non-stress academy, I guess is the best way to describe it. We only dictate the minimum content. There are both in the state of California. There are some stress academies and there's some non-stress academies. Historically, again, that has been left up to the presenter. I have not seen evidence of any studies in California in terms of the efficacy or which is better, but there are both in the state of California. We do address when there are egregious.
Sorry, could you explain to my colleagues what the difference is? Or my take is the first one is more non-stress is kind of academic, collegial. Stress is more like a military boot camp, roughly.
Correct.
Speaking.
Correct. That's exactly the best way to describe it. That's how I would describe it. So there are both. There are both stress militarist, not militaristic, but kind of paramilitary style academy training courses in California, both at community colleges and at police, law enforcement departments. And then there's the more collegiate style academic, less stress academy structure, but the minimum content is at least the same at both. I don't know which is better. There are different opinions on that. I think you will see that across the law enforcement spectrum. I think we have differing opinions of that at Post, but I have not seen any specific studies at least in California, as to which is better. And Commissioner, I apologize. I missed the second part of your question.
So the critics of police training say that there's little scientific basis for common practices. There's the Tueller rule, which is the 21-foot rule, that you have to do something because it would take an officer a particular period of time to unholster his or her weapon. And therefore the 21-foot thing, which even the author, the guy who it's named after, said there's no scientific basis for it. So how do you guard against common practices which have no evidence base, or how do you take evidence and create a practice?
Well, we make decisions as Post staff fairly regularly as to what should be included as minimum training standards. I'll give you some examples. So there was an academy that wanted to do certain training on emergency vehicle operations. It was a high-speed, I'm going to kind of wing it a little bit here, but making a 90-degree turn at 60 miles an hour through an intersection. One, we thought, hey, realistically, that's probably not going to happen in the real world. It's not going to be done. It's extremely dangerous, and we don't want to set the tone for that type of driving behavior at the academy or an in-service training. So we did not certify that course. We said, hey, you can't do it. So we do make those judgment calls, but primarily most of the judgment calls come in terms of judgment calls. Most of our focus is on the minimum training standards set by the state and by the commission. I hope that answers your question, sir. I don't want to, give my personal feelings.
Thank you. I got it.
On certain tactics. A lot of the tactics questions are left to individual departments. I think there is a lot of debate. As I've said, I think in the profession on the 21-foot rule on driving around a 90-degree turn, there's a lot of debate. There's debate inside a post as to what is right and what is wrong. But I think it would be wise for me not to get into those discussions today, because they would be personal opinions at this point.
I have, thank you. I have Commissioner Buises unmuted.
Morning, Mr. Alvarez. Thank you for joining us. My question is around the composition of the post commission, because I saw that it is largely composed of law enforcement. Are there civilian members of the commission? And if so, how are they chosen and which sectors do they come from? I'm asking this partly because part of our report, of course, is there's now some type of cooperation between criminal justice experts and law enforcement in addressing some of these issues. So I'm just curious from your vantage point, what you say about that.
Yes. So the makeup of the commission is dictated by the penal code. It's penal code section 13500. It's been around for quite a while. It was modified a year and a half ago. There are some public members on the commission. So the makeup of the commission in general terms is 5 chiefs and sheriffs from law enforcement, 5 sergeant or below rank officers, an educator, a city elected official, a county elected official, 2 public members, and as well as an ex officio position for the attorney general. The penal code was modified 2 years ago to add 2 additional public members. One is selected by the Senate pro tem, and one is selected by the Speaker of the Assembly. So one of the positions is vacant right now. We do have 3 current public members. One is a former staffer in the Assembly and the Senate inside the Capitol in California. One is the head of the NAACP in Silicon Valley. And the other was selected by the Senate pro tem, is an individual who is a fire executive as well as a city manager across many different cities in California and across the country. So there are some public members. Yes, ma'am.
You also have an advisory body.
And we do have an advisory body. We have 2 subcommittees. One is a finance committee, which is made up of commissioners. And then we have an advisory committee, which also has both law enforcement individuals, private presenters, some of the labor associations, as well as some public members that sit on that commission as well, or on that committee.
And you may have mentioned it, but I think on the post, the parent, I'm gonna call it the parent committee, there's 15 of those appointments are made by the governor, correct?
Yes, sir.
Right. So look to the governor to see what those see who represent those appointments, and they're, I mean, it is encouraging that they added public members to the post commission, and they also have the advisory body.
Yes.
So
and
you
it's Okay.
Go ahead, please. Sorry.
No, and I know there was one of the very first questions I didn't answer, and I don't know if you would like me to move forward to that answer on how courses are certified and how they're brought to post. So
Yeah, please.
okay, so a department can post agency, a community college, or what we call a private presenter can present a case, present a training course across the state of California. They have to come to post first to do that. If it is a private presenter, a private company, they have to petition, they have to make a request to post to get an ID number and such, and we just kind of have to vet them to give them that ID number. Once that process is moved along for a private presenter, as well as a department and a community college, they can go into our system. We have a database where they populate their training course pursuant to existing regulation. The regulation is very rigid in what they have to do in terms of the training and what material they have to present to post prior to getting the course certified. That is submitted by the individual presenter, whether it's ABC Company or San Diego Sheriff's Department. We have a regional, once it's submitted, a regional consultant will review that course, as well as a bureau chief. So we'll have 2 staff members to make sure that it's compliant with regulation and it's what we want to have certified within our course catalog. Some courses we don't. We just say, hey, this may be quality training, but it's such a niche area that it really has nothing to do with us, or we don't have the expertise to certify it, so we won't certify it. At that time, we also apply one of the reimbursement plans to it, or say that, hey, it's not going to get any reimbursement because it doesn't fit within our priorities. That's how it's submitted to post, and that's how it gets certified. As I mentioned at the beginning, depending on the course number, if it's an odd or an even number, I don't know what we're on this year, let's say it's even numbers, they automatically get placed into a pending inactive status every 2 years. The presenter has to go through the course to make sure it's contemporary and consistent with the law, and then they have to resubmit it back to post, and it has to go through the same review process to make sure that it's contemporary, and then we open it up again and make it active. So that's the process.
So,
Sure.
Mr. Alvarez,
Right.
if I may, I thank you for describing that. And I'm going to ask a question that you may not be able to answer, but in your experience with post, is that process perfect, or are there areas where you think it could be improved?
Boy, I would be crazy to say anything's perfect, right? I don't think we're arrogant enough at Post to say we're perfect, or that, hey, we got to stop because we've hit the mark. No, I mean, I think there is a number of hiccups with that process initially. Not initially. I mean, one, it's gone from an paper-based process to an automated process. That took some challenges. Then we were still doing the automated process in a paper fashion. There's a lot of courses, 4,600 courses that have to remain active, and a lot of reviews that have to be conducted. That's a challenge for us, and we can always do better. We have sped up the time it takes for us to get the course certified. We've now gone back, this is something we just did recently, and it was not without some controversy and not without some serious heavy lifting by the field as well as by Post. We went through all of our use of force courses to make sure that they, at a minimum, talked about the recent legislation in California changing the use of force standard. Perhaps that wasn't discussed in their use of force course, and we wanted them to have those discussions regardless of what the course was. So we put them all into modification and mandated that happen. Those little tweaks are fairly constant. We do go and audit a lot of those courses, and we prioritize them. Over the last couple of years, we've prioritized use of force, de-escalation, and mental health, as well as some of the leadership courses. where we go and sit in on the courses to make sure that it's the right instructor, that the instructor is the instructor who we have on record, that the materials that are being handed out are consistent with what we were told was going to be released or distributed, and that the instructors actually do a good job and that the students like that, like the course. There's always tweaks that we're doing. I think getting more feedback from the students is always something that we strive for. It's hard for us to capture. We do have surveys that are submitted, but I think getting more feedback would be ideal. I know one of the topics, or what was said at the very beginning, is, well, how do you know that your training's good? That is something we always struggle with. We don't see what happens on the back end. None of the posts across the state or across the country get the back end information. So if you have a use of force training course, we don't know what happens with that officer when they leave. They go through it's kind of like going to college. You go to college, you get your degree, and then the college kind of loses track of you, doesn't know how you did, that happens with us. We don't see the back end information of what happens with that individual officer. So sometimes it's hard to do the research. We try to do surveys. We try to do surveys sometimes after 6 months. Sometimes we'll go back. That is an area that I think we would benefit from. But in talking to university and college researchers, as well as posts across the country, we all struggle with that. I think there is a place for colleges and universities to do those independent studies for entities like Post to come back and say, hey, you did use of force training. We did a study and here's the results of your training. Right now, a lot of times it's a quantitative. We address how good a course is based on how many people took it. And we know that's not the right answer, right? It's not necessarily qualitative at times on the back end. So that's the biggest struggle, I think, for us.
I'm sorry, Pedro, I'm keep
No, please.
But so it seems to me, based on what you've said, that it might be worth the Little Hoover Commission exploring the possibility of working with Post and with the academies, if there is a use of force, to go back, a challenged use of force, to go back and see what training that particular officer went through. And if you start seeing a pattern of 4 or 5 officers who've had some questions with their use of force, that maybe that particular training isn't good. And so that would get you more into the subjective analysis than the quantitative analysis. So is that sort of what might be helpful to you with your training?
I think an independent review is always a positive for us. And we've talked a lot about, trying to get independent reviews of what we do, and whether its quality is always a positive. I don't think it necessarily has to just equate to use of force. I mean, it could be anything, really. It can be mental health training. It can be, hey, an entire department may go through mental health training. What effect has that mental health training had on that department or those officers? I think is a positive. We welcome that kind of independent review of what we do. And I know there's departments out there that are willing to participate in those programs. I've heard of several of them that have, and I'll give you one example without naming the university as well as the department, but one of the universities reached out to us and wanted to do a study on body cams and report writing a couple of years ago. The research is not out yet, but and it's a big, well-known university and a big, well-known department that participated in it. But they wanted to take officers, put them through some simulated training with body cams, have them write the report immediately after, have them wait a week, or have them review the video and then write the report to see what is the most accurate and what is the best that the profession can provide. Those things are invaluable, I think, for law enforcement if independent bodies are willing to do it and police departments are willing to participate. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, all right. Any other commissioners? If not, then Mr. Alvarez, even if repeated, interrupted you and to derail your train of thought, you can continue if you want to have some other areas you want to cover.
Okay, the only other thing that I wanted to mention is I know there's been some discussion about, well, how are these decisions made as to how training occurs and how it doesn't occur. And it kind of happens in two primary ways. One, the legislature does make mandates of post and of police departments or peace officers for training. And I'll give you some examples of that. And then the second part is the commission sets certain requirements upon peace officers and departments for training. So both of those things are how training gets done. So in terms of ledge mandates, just to give you an idea, there is a legislative mandate that says, post, you will teach bloodborne pathogens in the basic academy, and every peace officer will receive bloodborne pathogen training every year. So that impacts both the academy and in service. There's another requirement on child abuse. Child abuse has to be taught in the academy. It doesn't have to be taught in service. There's another law that says you have to teach domestic violence complaint training in the academy, as well as every patrol officer or everybody below the rank of supervisor in a department has to have training on domestic violence complaints every 2 years. Some legislation requires hours be placed on the training. Mental health training is a perfect example. A law that basically says posts, you will train a minimum of 15 hours of mental health training in the basic academy, and you will require your field training officers to take an additional 8 hours of mental health training in the field training program when they get certified to be field training officers. So there are some legislative mandates that go into the basic academy as well as to in-service. The commission also makes mandates of departments in terms of training their personnel. For instance, every supervisor, every sergeant is required to go through a 2-week supervisor school within 1 year of appointment. Every lieutenant is required to go through a 3-week management training course within 1 year of appointment. I already mentioned the minimum training requirements of 24 hours. Of those, 14 hours are set by the commission on arrest and control, driving, and firearms, and communications, or de-escalation through strategic communications. 14 hours are mandated by the commission. The commission also is very forward-leaning, so to speak, in terms of what's coming out of the legislature and what's being demanded of them and of law enforcement by the community. So recently, in 2019, they approved and inserted de-escalation training into the academy, an additional training block. Now it is use of force and de-escalation training. They mandated that principled policing and implicit bias training be inserted into the academy in 2019. So they're sensing what the community wants as well and mandating that type of training to occur both either in the academy or in service training. Sometimes the post staff will make recommendations to the commission on what we think should be mandated, and sometimes they ask us to do research and bring it to the commission, and they're the ultimate ones that make those decisions. Post staff does not. Once the commission mandates certain type of training or some form of regulation, obviously it has to go through the rulemaking process through the Office of Administrative Law, and then it gets codified in the CC&Rs and in our regulations. So that's how post training is developed in-house, aside from the presenters bringing us their training courses. At the same time, we will incentivize topics that are important to the community and to the legislature and to the governor. So mental health is a perfect example, and use of force. All of those courses 2 years ago that were previously not funded, we didn't have the funding to back those courses, we pumped in tons of money into training contracts as well as to reimbursement plans to get people to go to those types of training courses. So that's how it all kind of happens. And that was,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
that's what I prepared in my notes, Mr. Chair, for the presentation. I'm happy to answer as many questions as I possibly can or take as long as you'd like.
Thank you. Commissioner Arner.
So I want to thank you, first of all, for an excellent presentation. So at the other end, in other words, at the police department end, how do they handle managing what courses they want their police officers to take? Because I mean, there are 41, you said 4,100 options here. Some, I guess, are mandated by statute and stuff like that. But how is it managed by police departments and their HR departments?
So most medium and large departments have a training manager, and if they usually have some form of a schedule in terms of what they want to deliver in terms of their training. So some will do the mandates early on in that 2-year cycle just to get it out of the way. Some spread it out. They know they're going to promote 30 sergeants this year, so they know they're going to have to send 30 people away. They're going to have to schedule people to come in and backfill them while they're away at training. So some departments are, I'd say probably 70 to 80% have training managers that schedule all of that. Some, that are small departments don't have the ability to have a full-time or even a part-time training manager, and they are simply trying to hit their mandates as they go along. And if they have somebody who needs interview and interrogation training, they look at the course catalog and they see when something's available and they do it. We also, when we do our audits of departments, we will meet with the departments and we'll go through the minimum training mandates and go, in most instances, unless it's a very large department like LAPD or LA Sheriff's, we'll go officer by officer. Officer Manny Alvarez is missing strategic communications. They need 2 hours of communications training. How are you going to get that? So we provide them the reports. They can go into our system and run compliance checks to see what is missing for their officers. And obviously they have to do a very good job of scheduling. If you have 30 people being promoted to sergeant, or you have a rotation in a detective bureau, and you have to have them trained up. Some of the detectives, they have to go through certain training. I believe it's sexual assaults, if you're going to work sexual assaults in California, you've got to go through the post course. So it does take a little bit of planning on their part. The bigger departments have units that do it. The medium departments have personnel that are, full-time or part-time doing it. So that's kind of how it works. It's, we have a lot of small departments in California, as you know, and it's a challenge for them just to keep their staffing up, let alone, plan for all this stuff. And we try to help them as best we can. That's our goal.
We've got Commissioner Emerson, followed by Quirk and Schwanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarez, for your presentation. Appreciate it. In 2015, the legislature enacted field training on crisis management for mental illness individuals and individuals with intellectual disabilities, which required 8 hours. Is that an ongoing situation where every couple of years they have to go back and have additional training, or is that just a one-time 8-hour training?
So you're referring to the field training officers that receive people outside of once they complete their academy training. To be a field training officer, you have to go through a 40-hour training course. That 40-hour training course includes 8 hours of mental health training. They have to go through a refresher course every 3 years of 24 hours. I want to say, please don't quote me on it, but I want to say it's a one and done with the 8 hours. I don't believe they have to go through mental health training during the 24-hour course, but I would like to check on that and get back, because I'm afraid I'm going to give you a wrong answer. I don't know if they have to go through refresher mental health training at the 24-hour mark.
Okay, so let me follow up then. Field training officers, So just individual officers on the beat, do they get the 8 hours training as well?
They are not required to go through mental health training as a regular beat officer. I do not believe they are. Let me double check on that as well. I don't know if when that legislation came up, if every officer, because it was in 2016, it was prior to me. A lot of times legislation will come out and say, hey, you have to do 15 hours in the academy. If they didn't get it in the academy, you got to make it up. I just have to go back and look and see if they had to make it up in 2016.
Yeah, yes. Okay, I'd appreciate it if you could follow up with the commission on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Quirk.
Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome.
I'm on the Public Safety Committee, so every year there seem all of these worthwhile efforts to change the way training is done and basically to add more hours. And we know that it all can't be done. So one of the questions is, how do we evaluate whether or not we should add something? Are you already overstressed and maybe we should be taking some things off? And then how do we evaluate the training that's required so far, whether it's worthwhile?
Yeah, I guess this is a little bit more of my personal feelings.
That's okay.
I think that I think that at times there is training that is mandated by whoever, the commission or the legislature, and it's the easy answer is just to throw it in the academy, and sometimes that's not the best place to put it. I mean, as you know, or as I mentioned early on, it takes a good 2 years before they get their basic certificate and before they're kind of on their own, doing their own work. And if you teach something that is either a complicated topic or something they're not even going to use for the first couple of years of their career, and you throw it into the academy, it's wasted. It's just a waste of time. It would be better to provide that training at the 2-year mark, at the 3-year mark, at their 4-year mark, when they're ready to have it. We jokingly refer inside the building. It's like, it's the basic academy. It's basic. Why are we throwing in all of this complicated stuff that they're not going to use, or stuff they're not going to use that may not be that complicated? They're not going to use it for 2 or 3 years. We're teaching it at the academy. There's some of that, I believe, there. I think also sometimes it's lost in terms of costs. What are the costs to do training? Well, it is not that costly at times for posts to develop training. We can develop a 2-hour training course on whatever it is fairly simple and not that costly. The challenge, though, is if you require that for 90,000 people across the state of California, there is a cost to those communities, right? They either don't have an officer or a dispatcher doing their regular work. They've been taken away to go do training. And that's where the costs, come up. A lot of these departments are already stressed in terms of having to do minimum staffing, and to pull people away is a challenge for them. Even big departments have significant challenges when they have to staff jails or contract cities for sheriffs. So that's my best answer. I think that a lot of stuff gets thrown into the academy, and I think some of us believe that maybe it should be done later. Not saying it shouldn't be done or that it's not important, but it may be better suited for down the road.
So I'm willing to say that none of us on Public Safety Committee are experts. Maybe some of our staff know more than we do, but they're probably still not experts. It would be very helpful if you could, where you've got these sort of inelastic requirements, that it be done in the academy. I would be glad to work with you on changes you'd like to see, that certain training be done later, et cetera. I'll talk to the committee chair about it, but in the meantime, perhaps the appropriate person on the commission here could keep us in touch, give us each other's email, And we could work together with whoever is the proper person on post staff to revise the requirements we have so that they become more appropriate, that the professionals feel are more appropriate, either that something isn't working or has to be at a different time. And I'm pretty sure that my colleagues who think that this training is necessary, but really don't know how well it's working or what year it should be in, whether it's better done after somebody's had 3 or 4 years experience, we'd be glad to hear from you on that and revise the way we've done it. It's not like we've put something in stone that we think we really know everything that should be done. So let's get in touch. I'll get my staff member who works on public safety with me to work with whoever is appropriate with you. And we'll try and do some revisions starting next year. So let's commit to that. Chair Nava, is there someone who can, on the commission, who can make sure that Mr. Alvarez and I keep in touch and work on this project?
Yeah, I would nominate Ms. Foster.
Yes, Assembly member, we will, at the staff level, we will make sure that you and Mr. Alvarez are connected and that we are working with your staff as well, Assembly member.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may, Mr.
Absolutely.
Chair, just to provide a contradictory statement to what I said, the challenge though also is it's a lot cheaper to teach at the academy than it is once they're on the streets and existing officers, right? To bring everybody back at the 2-year mark is much, much more costly. I think LAPD does that. They're able to do that. They bring their people back, I want to say at the 2-year and at the 5-year mark to go through certain training, but it's much more expensive to do it that way.
All right, well, we're going to listen to whatever you have to say.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Of course. Commissioner Schwamberger.
Yeah, I feel like what I was thinking about is very much of a continuation of what Assemblymember Quirk brought up, because as I read Mr. Alvarez, the information you submitted, and then listening to your testimony, it starts to feel like here's the basic training, and then other things keep dropping in as mandates from the legislature. All really good stuff. There's no doubt about it. But I wondered if after a time, it feels a little bit more like a list of boxes that need to get checked rather than, meaningful, effective training that changes behaviors where you want the behavior changed. And that's why I really appreciated this idea of what's the life cycle? Like when should training be done in the life cycle, and would it be better to have it be looked at somewhat holistically rather than, here's another thing we have to do. Because I think of it just as an employee at my company. If it starts feeling like here's another thing you have to do, here's another part of the annual, it gets to a point you just can't wait to get through it and you check the box, rather than having it feel like really meaningful behavior modifying training. So that, I guess there's not a question in there, but I think I feel like the conversation you just had with Assemblymember Quirk, it feels like we're onto something there. I don't know, any thoughts about that?
Well, again, it's a personal observation on my part, but I think the term life cycle is perfect. And I think that a lot of the larger departments do exactly that. It's a continuation throughout their career, and they can digest the information differently as they progress, as opposed to just throwing it at them at the basic academy or, whenever need to be. I think LAPD is a perfect example. They do that. They have the ability to do that. I believe CHP also does some of that, but LAPD brings back, I think they bring them back as an academy class, if I'm not mistaken. The whole class comes back for 2 or 3 weeks at the 2-year mark. And then I believe at the 5-year mark, they come back again as an academy class and go through some advanced officer training now that they're somewhat seasoned, and it's just received better. I think that it's, they understand it and they get it. I'll give you an example of where we, I don't know if we've hit the mark or we haven't hit the mark. So we do procedural justice and implicit bias training. And I think it's really, really good quality training. We threw that into the academy as under a pilot program. We took the in-service course and we threw it into the academy and said three different academies. The cadets just didn't get it. They didn't, I mean, they got it, but when you get the feedback from, they just didn't have the experiences to be able to digest the information. And one of the blocks is on like cynicism. And it's like, it's like, yeah, we don't get this. We don't have any cynicism at this point. So I do think that should be in the academy in some fashion, but sometimes it just doesn't equate based on the student. And so, no, I agree with what you said, ma'am. But that's my personal feeling. It's just it's expensive. Let's face it, it would be very expensive, but and it would be a challenge for those departments to put that together, especially with scheduling and such. I mean, they have a hard enough time already with like the sergeants having to go to the course within a 1 year of appointment to meet that requirement. To bring them back at the 2 year mark or 5 year mark would be a challenge for them and for us.
Let me ask, when you say bring them back, are you saying they actually physically leave their department and go somewhere?
Well, a lot of times they have to, right? I'm not saying that they would have to go back to an academy, but a lot of times, especially small and medium-sized departments that don't have the capacity or the ability to train their personnel, they have to send them away. Unless you're, LAPD or LA Sheriffs, if you're, some small department in Northern California with 20 officers, you haven't certified the course for your own people. You can't have 20 officers completely offline doing the training. So you send 2 or 3 of them away at a time so you could still staff the city and still meet the training requirements. So yet a lot of them do require travel. Sometimes it's short. We try to make it short for them so that there's training facilities within I believe a 2-hour drive for them, but sometimes they do have to travel great distances to meet those training requirements. Yes.
Have you had much experience with offering training online? I mean, given what we've seen in other aspects of society in terms of working from home because of the COVID and the increase in this sort of thing, Zoom meetings, is there training, do you believe, that would be accessible online in sort of experience we're having here? Or maybe not.
Yes. So first of all, the training regulations allow for online training, the existing training regulations. It wasn't really being done prior to COVID, but it would allow you to do training in this fashion. With COVID, there's a number of presenters that started to do that, or departments to do online training. They have to notify us that that's what they're going to do inside of our system, but they can do that, and they have been doing that. They're not allowed to do that for basic academy training. That, however, we did receive an executive order from Governor Newsom in May to allow for that and on an as-needed basis. And we have had some academies do short blocks of online training for their academy cadets, primarily when they've had COVID outbreaks. On the other side of it, we do have 2 other we have one program and then a grant program that was instituted last year with money dedicated in the budget for distance learning grants. So we distributed, I believe, close to $5 million for distance learning training to academic institutions as well as to law enforcement agencies. So entities such as UCLA, LAPD received grants to do distance learning. Some of them are, hey, it's a 4-hour course, you log on, you do it. Some of them are extended using platforms like Canvas and Blackboard, where they go on for an extended period of time through a training curriculum. So that is out there as we speak, and it's on 5 different areas of instruction: use of force, de-escalation, use of force and de-escalation, mental health training, community policing, racial profiling, or I'm sorry, bias-based policing, and officer wellness. Aside from that, we also have an LMS, or learning management system, inside of Post that we call the Learning Portal, that houses self-paced training courses where you go through it. They're interactive, animated. There's videos. There's assessments that you have to take as you go through. They're usually in 2-hour increments. We're starting to roll them out in shorter length courses. And there's also video-based training courses on the learning management system. Coincidentally, I just ran the numbers yesterday on the last 2 years, because the cycle just ended, the 2-year training cycle. The first year, approximately 4% of the post-certified training was done on the learning management system. And in the second year, it was 14.5% of all post-certified training was online. We try our best whenever there is a mandate for either by the commission or by the legislature to put some form of training online on the learning management system. So those departments that are very far away, maybe have 3 or 4 officers, if they have to take bloodborne pathogens training, they can do it online on our system and get credit. So we do that. And I sent Ms. Foster some information on like 5 or 6 or 7 different training courses that we released on the learning management system this year alone.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other commissioners have questions or comments at this juncture? I don't see. Did somebody raise a hand? Because I can't see hand raising.
No, I do not believe anyone has raised their hand, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
No, Commissioner.
All right. Well, then let me express on behalf of the commission gratitude to Mr. Alvarez for well presented information with respect to Post. I think that we've certainly received an education and some insight into recognize any as the critically important organization. You've got about 116 employees, somewhere around that, 120 or so, and producing quality material and providing some direction for California's peace officers. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you for the time and for allowing me to speak and for the interest. And I just would like to also just thank my predecessors at Post. I think it was mentioned today that Post was developed in 1959, and I do believe that we are the best across the country. We're not arrogant enough to say that we need to stop. Obviously, we need to continue and get better and better and stay the best. But our predecessors have just done a phenomenal job building Post into what it is. And the staff at Post, obviously with 116, 120 staff members at any given time, we have a big responsibility, and they work really passionately and very hard. So I thank them as well. But thank you, sir, for allowing.
Of course. And also, I would miss if I didn't mention that your Post chair,
Pardon me, sir?
The chair of Post is the district attorney, Santa Barbara.
He is. The chair of the commission currently is the county elected official on the commission, which is Chair Joyce Dudley, or the district attorney for Santa Barbara. Yes, sir.
Right. Anyway, thank you very much, Foster. I think you're up again.
Yes, thank you. I would like to now call for David Billingsley. Mr. Billingsley has served as committee counsel to the Assembly Committee on Public Safety since March 2015. Previously, for more than 10 years, he served as an attorney with a private legal practice in the Bay Area, which specialized in criminal defense and the plaintiff's personal injury. He began his career as a public defender in Contra Costa and Alameda counties. Welcome, Mr. Billingsley, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, Senator, Assembly members, and staff.
I just want to say that I'm very proud to have hired David onto Public Safety Committee, and he's been extraordinary in his time there, and I always take his advice now as a member of the committee. We have a great staff on the Assembly Public Safety as well as in the Senate. They're extremely knowledgeable, and I'm really glad to see you here today, David.
Assembly member, thank you so much for your kind words. And yes, we are quite lucky that we do have very good staff. And as Assembly member Quirk said, it's true on both the Assembly side and on the Senate side. I'm here to talk to you a little bit and give you a perspective from a committee staff standpoint about how the legislature has dealt with police training issues, particularly over the course of the past 10 years. And as you probably know, within the legislature, bills are sent to policy committee for a more in-depth policy analysis. So with respect to police training bills, those bills do go through both the Assembly Public Safety Committee and the Senate Public Safety Committee. Within the committees, committee staff members like myself will conduct an analysis of the bill that will be turned into a written product that is ultimately made available to the public. And we are giving advice to the chair and members of the committee, as well as members of the legislature in general. So to the extent I'm talking about the legislative process with respect to peace officer training bills, it is coming through the viewpoint of a committee staffer. So you should just recognize that. And you, of course, are lucky enough to have both Senator Nielsen and Assemblymember Quirk to give some perspective as legislative members on this issue. But during the past 10 years, the legislature introduced roughly 30 bills that were explicitly dealing with peace officer training. And when I mean explicitly dealing with peace officer training, they were giving posts some type of directive to either develop a course in a particular policy area, to add requirements to an existing course, or to impose specific time mandates that either basic cadets or in-service peace officers needed to comply with. Of the roughly 30 bills that were introduced, roughly a quarter of those were ultimately chaptered into law. In terms of some of the areas that the legislature has focused on for the past 10 years for peace officer training, it basically breaks down into two categories. The legislature is either trying to get peace officer training to focus on peace officers' interactions with particular populations, or they are focusing training on the investigation of certain classes or types of crimes. So with respect to training on certain populations, some of the bills that we've seen during the past 10 years involve the population that is dealing with mental health issues. So we have seen bills on mental health, peace officer mental health, or peace officer training for interacting with individuals with mental health issues, specifically focusing on crisis intervention training and de-escalation. We've seen training bills to educate officers on interacting with issues surrounding gender or sexual identity, on issues of implicit bias and racial profiling. Some of the types of crimes that we've seen the legislature indicate should be priorities for training are crimes involving elder abuse and dependent adult crimes, domestic violence, human trafficking, specifically the commercial sexual exploitation of children, and also gun violence restraining orders. Now, some of the reasons that the legislature have focused on these areas is that the legislature has felt that these areas need particular attention. Sometimes the issue area is coming to the attention of the legislature through what the legislators are seeing take place in their community, or issues that have come up through the media. Sometimes these issues are highlighted because stakeholders within the criminal justice community identify these as being areas that need particular attention. And sometimes these areas are highlighted by particular interest groups. For example, one of the areas that the legislature introduced a bill on for peace officer training was gun violence restraining orders. And that's an area where the legislature had made a new change in the law, where they created a process to issue a gun violence restraining order. if a family member or perhaps a police officer felt that a person was in imminent danger of committing some type of violent act, that family member or peace officer could then go to a court, get a gun violence restraining order issued, which would prohibit that person from being in possession of a firearm for a period of 1 to 5 years. That was a new change in law. When the legislature made that new change in law, that made a trickle-down effect, which of course requires post and individual peace officer agencies to train on that. But the legislature also felt that there was, an area where some explicit training could potentially be necessary, and a bill was introduced on it. An area where something came to the attention of a particular legislature was based on an interest group. It was in 2015, there was a bill that was introduced to require training on the profiling of motorcycle riders within the existing training requirements that dealt with profiling. And that was something that came to the attention because, there is a group of motorcycle riders that felt that there was a certain amount of disparate treatment that they were experiencing simply because of the fact that they were riding motorcycles. The peace officer training bills that have been introduced over the past 10 years have been directed at different areas of the officer's development and status. As you heard from Mr. Alvarez from Post, sometimes the legislature has introduced and ultimately chaptered bills that have required changes in the training requirement for the basic curriculum, which is when the individual is at a cadet status before they have been employed. That is the 664-hour course of training that they must complete in order to be eligible for employment. Some of the other pieces of legislation that have been introduced deal with ongoing education after the officer has become employed at a particular agency, and they can be requirements that those officers are required to complete after that point. There are also some differences in terms of the way the mandates or the bills have been structured. The most significant mandates that the legislature have implemented in terms of training requirements are when they require a specific number of hours on an area of training. And as Mr. Alvarez also referenced, there was a mandate in 2015 regarding peace officer training for interaction with individuals with mental health issues that mandated a 15-hour requirement during the basic training course, and then a requirement for the field training officers to take a course that's a minimum of 8 hours. Now, frequently, to the extent that the legislature is acting on peace officer training issues, they are not seeking to impose particular requirements in terms of an hourly amount. Many times they are simply directing Post to develop a course in a policy area that the legislature feels needs to be addressed or highlighted. Now, in those cases, when Post is required to develop a course by the legislature, it does not necessarily mean that any particular officer or any cadet during the basic training course is going to be required to see that course or attend that course. It can simply be whether or not that course is made available. Some of the other ways that the legislature has sought to highlight particular legislative policy priorities is providing some framework for Post to implement certain policy principles within their existing training programs. And so frequently that can be done within areas that Post is already currently teaching, either at a basic training level or at a continuing education course. If they already have a class on profiling, the legislature might direct that Post incorporate certain principles involving implicit bias. And one of the things to be aware of is just in terms of peace officer training and the legislature's effect on how that takes place is, to the extent that we've been talking about legislative action so far, it's been based on some of the explicit training requirements that the legislature has directed posts to include in their courses. But the legislature also has an effect on training requirements simply by passing any new standard that applies to police officers or requiring police agencies to engage or develop certain policies. And those policy changes don't necessarily come with a explicit directive to post to develop a course or to do particular things regarding training. But as a practical matter, if the legislature makes changes to state law, which puts certain requirements on peace officers or changes the standard of law from what peace officers have been using up until that point, it is going to have a trickle-down effect in terms of requiring that the officers be trained to whatever those new standards are. And some examples of that would be a couple of years ago, the legislature made some changes to the law regarding peace officer use of force. That bill did not necessarily contain any specific directives to post, but the change to the standard of use of force requires each peace officer agency to train to that new standard, and of course requires post to also train to those standards in any of their curriculum that is currently dealing with use of force. In a similar fashion, a couple of years ago, the legislature also, with respect to use of force, directed each law enforcement agency that they must develop a use of force policy, and that the use of force policy must incorporate certain policy practices and certain things with respect to, again, use of force, reporting on use of force, de-escalation techniques. And that bill also didn't come with a explicit training directive to post, but to the extent that the law enforcement agencies need to incorporate those changes, the officers working at those law enforcement agencies are going to have to be trained to those new policies. So I would just suggest, as you're looking at the issue of peace officer training and how the legislature is affecting that, it's not only the explicit training requirements, it can also be changes to what has been existing standards or policies.
Billingsley, let me interrupt you just a moment. Commissioner Aaroner has a
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, thank you. David, I was wondering, as the legislature is contemplating these new requirements, whether they be generated because of a change in the statute regarding, as you've been discussing, where something has changed in the law, and then there is an impact on training, right? That kind of thing. Does the legislature also put a fiscal? I mean, I'm presuming that these things all have costs, and I kind of remember when I was in the legislature that very often public safety bills actually would come out and go through approps and with showing no fiscal effect, right? Even though we all knew that there was significant fiscal impacts. And so I'm presuming, I don't know if that's changed now, if actually, as these kinds of bills are moving through, there are costs to the local police departments, I'm presuming, as well as to post, right? And how does that all play out? Where does that play out in regards to ensuring that, I mean, I'm sure police departments don't necessarily argue against the idea of the training, but I'm sure that they bring up the issue with this as Mr. Alvarez said before. How do you move 30 trainees right through a training process? That means somebody has to take their position while they're off doing that. How does that play out now?
No, you are absolutely right that any of these issues, either with the explicit training or changing standards, can trigger costs that need to be evaluated by the legislature. And the way, sort of the initial way that the bills get flagged is that when they are introduced, They go to the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee makes an initial evaluation as to whether or not the legislative proposal is going to carry any costs. If it is deemed to carry any cost, it will be marked fiscal. And in addition to going to a policy committee, it's also going to go to the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee is going to be screening that legislative proposal as to costs and how it fits into the general budget that the legislature has to work with for the year, and whether or not the cost for that bill is going to be manageable. If the Appropriations Committee decides, the policy might have some merit, but ultimately the costs are too much to justify it given the other legislative priorities, it will not make it out of appropriations and will not make it to the floor. The costs that are identified in the bill, as you can imagine, are a subject of much discussion and much input from different people who might evaluate the cost as being higher. Other people might evaluate the cost as lower, but that input is taking place in the Appropriations Committee. I have yet to see a peace officer training bill that is not tagged fiscal. Those go through the Appropriations Committee. To the extent we're talking about the other changes to standards, again, say use of force or requiring law enforcement agencies to impose certain use of force policies within their individual agencies, those bills were both marked fiscal and were both, I think, heard in appropriations. But it is an issue of much discussion in terms of how much costs are going to be connected with these proposals. When we are specifically looking at training bills, within the policy committees themselves, the bills are generally, I'm going to say, fairly well received. The general concept of having training on particular areas that might need more attention is, from a policy standpoint, not necessarily a problem. And frequently these bills do move out of the policy committee. Frequently they do die in appropriations, precisely because of the cost issue. That is one reason why frequently when you see a peace officer training bill move through the process, if it starts with a mandate for a certain number of hours of training for each officer, it might not wind up ending up going through getting to the governor's desk in that fashion. It might wind up going from a certain number of hours down to, at the end of the process, just a direction that develop a course of curriculum that is available to all officers, because that is a much lower cost requirement, as Mr. Alvarez was talking about. The other thing I would indicate is that in my experience, as these peace officer training bills, which are specifically providing some guidance or direction move through the process, the legislature is fairly keen to have input from post on how these proposals do fit into the general training requirements, because there is certainly a recognition in the legislature that there can be a limited amount of time that officers have. If you are talking about an officer that's currently employed, any training does take them away from their duties. Sometimes imposing a new training requirement in one area means a requirement for reduction in hours in others. And these are certainly all things that the legislature ultimately needs to be mindful of and definitely looks to post for guidance on. But the cost issue tends to be the one where these bills run into the most problem.
Thanks.
Training bills are largely bipartisan. In my committee, my committee is quite contentious in terms of the policy proposals that are generally in committee. Training bills are an area where there tends to be bipartisan agreement that they are good ideas, but fiscally, big issue.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I pipe in here just briefly?
Mr. Chairman, you are muted. So I'm sure
Sorry.
you may, Senator Nielsen. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my apologies.
Well, Mr. Billingsley did a great job explaining. There is an issue I'd like to add to that. It's a historic one. It is not a new one, but it is the impact on other government entities, particularly local government. And it is a mandate imposed by the legislature that impacts local government, but the mandate is not funded.
Right.
It came up with me just as recently as yesterday. Again, it is often a huge issue. Very often, as Mr. Billingsley states, it gets handled in the Appropriations Committee. Sometimes it gets dealt with in the Budget Committee, but we do have to be aware of these impacts on local governments. And they are I always say, the stepchildren of government, particularly county government, more so than even cities. And we have to be careful at how we impose on them new responsibilities and indeed costs that we do not recompense them for.
Actually, Jim, I was presuming that many of them started out with a state mandated claims provision in the bill, right? And then as the bill moved through appropriations and they changed the tone of the bill, all of a sudden that paragraph would be deleted because of, yeah, that's what I presumed as well.
There was an old thing that I keep reminding people of just because I've been around a long time, the SB 90 disclaimer. The legislature years ago got around that by just saying, this is not a mandate.
Exactly.
We do not owe you any money. Duh.
Right.
I never served in local government, but I certainly appreciate their plight.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're very welcome. Now, someone was telling me, is my sound clear? I was having problems with the microphone. Okay, good. Are there any other questions or comments? Because I'm looking at the outline, and thank you very much, Mr. Billingsley, for your written presentation. I'm following it as you've been speaking. Are there any other questions or comments from commissioners for Mr. Billingsley? Yes, Cynthia, please.
David, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm just very curious about what you said of, paying for these trainings in relation to some more progressive laws that's been passed in law enforcement reform. And I'm thinking of the use of force law that we now have in place. I read somewhere that there was a companion bill to it that was supposed to provide some funding for training police officers. Is that true, or where are we in terms of training police officers in relation to the use of force bill? That was, I think, it was in 2019. I know that it was a very controversial bill. I was in the Capitol when some of the tense conversations were going on in that, but I'm just very curious because I'm asking this question in relation to the very live conversation we're having right now vis-a-vis law enforcement and race. So I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Certainly. So you're absolutely right that the use of force or new peace officer use of force standard was passed, and I believe it was 2019. There was also that same year, there was what I'm going to refer to as a companion bill, which was, I think it's SB 230. It was a bill which required each law enforcement agency to establish certain elements regarding their use of force policies. Now, I think the concept from the legislature's standpoint, and this is just from my perspective, is that the two bills were intended to function together. There was going to be a new use of force standard, and there was going to be a bill requiring each law enforcement agency to establish policies requiring certain elements surrounding use of force that would help each law enforcement agency integrate this new use of force standpoint. Now, I'll have to tell you that in terms of some of the cost and specifically cost for training, that's above my pay grade. And I don't know what discussions or how that element played out as the bill went through the legislature. To my knowledge, there has not been a specific bill since those two bills passed that provided, funding specifically for training. Now, I could be wrong about that to the extent that perhaps the budget itself devoted some money to training, but I did not see a standalone bill that was introduced.
Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Any other questions? I don't any. Mr. Billingsley, I want to express gratitude on behalf of the commission for your testimony. I mean, as a former member, right? It's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so I apologize. But you know, it's all about making the sausage, and that's a little bit about what you've given us some insight today. Thank you very much for your testimony.
My pleasure to be here.
Ms. Foster, we have another witness, I believe.
All right. Thank you so much, David. Our last witness today is Mr. Joseph Cortez. Mr. Cortez is a police lieutenant in the Santa Monica Police Department, where he is assigned as the executive officer in the Office of the Chief of Police. He also serves as an associate professor at the University of Southern California and is the co-chair of the Research Advisory Committee for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Prior to his career in law enforcement, he served as a petty officer in the U.S. Navy for 8 years, and he is a decorated combat veteran. Thank you so much, Mr. Cortez, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Cortez, yeah, this is Pedro Nava, and I just want to let our commissioners know that Mr. Cortez does have some time restraints, so we should be as focused as we can. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, Vice Chairman, and members of this committee. I want to thank you again for allowing me to talk about law enforcement education. Now, I use the term education versus training purposely, as I believe we have done a relatively good job training our officers in the state of California compared to other places around the state or around the nation, as well as internationally. But I think that we need to transition our thoughts into the education frame versus just the training frame. The opinions I express here are solely my own. I want to make sure you recognize that, yes, I have several employers, but what I'm talking about today are the views and opinions of myself and not my employers or any of the committees that I serve on. As mentioned, I've been in law enforcement or been associated with law enforcement since 1997. I started as an explorer and I've worked my way up to the position, state police lieutenant, as an executive officer in the Office of the Chief of Police. I include my explorer time on purpose, because it is relevant to this testimony of being around and seeing the progression of training in law enforcement. As stated, my positions in the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Research Advisory Committee, as well as an associate professor where I teach at the master's level and undergrad level, where I authored and teach a public policy and crime class and the intersection of those two areas in government. So I do want to definitely highlight the fact that I'm also here as a member of the community and a devoted, loving husband and father of 2 daughters who are going to be living in these communities in the state of California, hopefully for the rest of their lives as well, and how important officer training and education is to me. As I submitted to you in my written comment, I've been a passionate person about law enforcement training and education for a very long time. I went and got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. I have my master's in emergency management, homeland security, and my doctorate in education, where I focused my actual research in the motivations and the influences of law enforcement training. I also come to you with nearly 3,000 hours of post-certified in-person and online training, federal training courses, and department training. So again, I come to you with my training education experience to encourage questions that lead to further discussion on a number of areas that deserve exploration in law enforcement training and education. For instance, I truly want to urge this commission to examine how, what, when, and where police officers receive their training. Although there's been extensive discussions on the requirements for police officer training at the basic level and as a holistic view of their training throughout their careers, there's not been a deep dive or in-depth evaluation of how the training methods are determining their effectiveness. I know after hearing several of you ask questions of Manny Alvarez, this is not something new to you. I'm not bringing you something new. I just want to reiterate it to you, this commission, and those who are watching online. It would also be beneficial to explore the consistency in current techniques of all police officer training to ensure California is utilizing evidence-based education programs, again, educational programs, to enhance the officer's decision-making and stress reduction. Requiring a consistent training educational plan or program that is evidence-based and supported by evidence and researchers and practitioners that lasts throughout the officer's career or even the personnel's career is very important. And it's an important topic for me. And overall, I believe it is very important to the law enforcement profession. Recognizing that officers have different educational needs as they progress through their careers, that's something that Manny Alvarez also touched upon, having everything dumped into which he called dumped or placed into the basic realm versus the LAPD, LASD model, or whoever he mentioned does the reach back and evaluation of training or further advanced officer training. Again, I'm trying to switch it to an advanced officer education and recognizing that the officers have different educational needs as they progress through their careers. These education and training programs must be built on the foundation of the skills that they are learning at the onset of their career. The programs also have to be grounded in logic, research, and evidence, as well as acknowledge that the individuals will have different levels of understanding of life and how they impact the lives of those in the community as peace officers, dispatchers, or other touch points from post. Building programs that encourage and incorporates formal educational opportunities outside of police. The police-only training model is something that I'm trying to bring to this commission to evaluate to see if that is the best way of going about it. I have a belief, again, these are my personal opinions, that having police-only training isn't the best way to go about it. But if they can have these formal educational opportunities that include courses with professors, psychologists, colleges, universities, they would also be able to gain a broader perspective of their role as peace officers and dispatchers in our community. The second area is that I'm going to ask for further exploration is how law enforcement training is delivered. We mentioned about how much it costs for training and the different aspects of it. Enhancing the remote learning, I feel, can broaden the perspectives of the officers in our state of California. Having experienced courses such as the post-supervisory course and management course, Supervisor Leadership Institute, SLI, and those management courses, I truly felt that the biggest education I received was from my fellow classmates from around the state. They were in different regions that dealt with things from a different lens, and that gave me a better view of how to possibly deal with different situations within my community. However, personnel and budget management surrounding law enforcement training is not only a complicated issue, but it's a complex puzzle. It's been mentioned here before. I just want to reiterate it again. The amount of time it takes to send someone to training, it is doubled because you have to bring in someone to backfill for the most part on routine basis, which then usually limits the equity, inclusion, and the access to this training to many of the agencies around the state. I would like that further explored about having these formal professor-led remote educational courses for law enforcement that can enhance that access and opportunity for the police officers on up to command staff as well, is because this needs to be an educational journey going from their onset of basic training through their career with having the education and consistent approach throughout their career. And third, I'm bringing to you a idea that I would like further explored is not just the peace officer training. It is not just peace officer education. It is also making sure that this commission looks at how and puts emphasis on what and how we are training and educating our police dispatchers. Oftentimes they're overlooked in this, in the larger apparatus of criminal justice system, law enforcement, policing, because they are the ones who are not on the streets. They are the ones who are but they are the ones who are first called. And oftentimes the dispatchers are the first contact with the public, and they can either enhance or de-escalate a situation with an individual on the phone. They also are the touch point for the officers responding to the call. And they also have the ability to de-escalate situations that are officer initiated. So I think that this commission has a great opportunity to look at how the education and training component with policing dispatching or public safety dispatching, and how key or how important that piece is. Because when officers hear the tone of the dispatcher's voice, that can either ramp them up or it can settle them down. So I think that's a very important part. And I'm very glad to be here to be part of this discussion. And I would welcome any questions that you have about my perspective on peace officer education and training, and how we can take this holistic view of training, not just as it's been done so far. And again, what we have now comes on the backs of many talented, smart, educated lawmakers, practitioners, and academics. And those staff members at Post have done a great job to get us to the training aspect of this. I just hope that we can look at this police officer education as a holistic opportunity to go through their education and have it go from the basic training all the way through. I'll leave my last comments with in my written statements, I talked a lot about college education. One of the things that have come up a lot is requiring college education. I think there's a barrier to legitimacy with the language we're using right now. We obtain and provide, or Post obtained information from peace officers, departments, and issues professional certificates. I think that we have an opportunity to enhance that language to ensure that individuals who look at the training officers receive are looking at it from a sense of it is a career of learning, not just something that they go to school for, get a degree, and start going through and doing their job. I believe that this educational program should be something that follows them through their career with synchronous and asynchronous activities, online learning, and being able to promote a evidence-based curriculum throughout their career. And I'm
Thank you. And just let me tell you, you've sparked some interest here. So the order I have is Vice Chairman Varner, then Commissioner Byer, Aaroner, Nielsen, and Schwamberger. So Commissioner Varner, Vice Chair Varner.
Thank you. Thank you, Lieutenant Cortez. Appreciate your testimony and you spending time with us. I had a kind of probably too broad of a question, but I want to just put this out there. As I look through the testimony, and maybe I missed something, but one of the things I think is critically important is I look back at the genesis of the word police, and it comes from, civil administration and the civility of it. And I think on-the-job training is so critical from the perspective of being part of the community and learning about your community, and learning about the diverse community that you have, and going in and getting to know the people, so that when you actually are out there, you're not immediately leaving you're not going on the job on the defensive and thinking that you're in danger. We always talk about the police force. We talk about every day our police officers are putting their lives in danger. How do we change that narrative to the police being part of the community and going out and actually when they encounter situations, maybe they know the person, or that they're going in knowing that they're in situations, maybe part of the dispatch that you talked about, it's important knowing that their life's not in danger when they're going to to see what's going on, or at least always be part of the community where they're engaging in a more meaningful way, not always just on the in a situation where it's a confrontation. Maybe they're out there engaging not on a call, that they're just on the beat, just going and talking to people.
So as far as I understand the question of being, how do we incorporate our community members with our training and education? Education needs to, there's a lot of mandates that come out through our, as explained, through the law, through posts and everything that is required to be a police officer. However, what I'm not seeing is how the regionalized training, meaning in the west side of Los Angeles County, there's not one particular class or idea of where that class came from, or there's not the intersection of people from the community in the same type of training that we're going through as well. So if you take an individual who is born, raised in Northern California and drop them into a city in San Diego, they're not going to have that perspective unless they have gone through a course that was talking about culture, talking about what is the trigger points in that community, what is right, what's wrong, what is their focus of, what do they want their focus of attention to be on for the police or law enforcement. So you bring up great points about the intersection of community and law enforcement education, bringing them together, bridging that gap. That I know that there are departments that I work for who have done that, who specifically have members of the community at the onset of every officer's career. They spend an entire day going through the community, going through the actual community on a bus and learning about the history. But that is one time, and I think that should be something that goes forward when people start to open this law enforcement training. That's not law enforcement sensitive. We're not giving the tools of the trade, but when we start educating people through their careers and understanding of the cultural diversity, the procedural justice, that those aren't law enforcement sensitive classes that could be opened up to members of the public that can provide their input to have that dialogue. So I think that there are many opportunities to not just have police only training, but opportunities to bring community members in who might have a great perspective and provide an eye-opening experience to the officers who are on the streets.
Thank you. Commissioner Byer?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for your service. There's a new book out by Rosa Brooks, Georgetown law professor who's also a police officer in the District of Columbia. The book is Tangled Up in Blue, and it raises a question along the lines of your comments about police dispatchers. In many, many instances, it seems as though we're trying to do too much with training and not recognizing the diversity of interactions that police officers have as part of a team. That is the dispatchers, the mental health workers, the emergency medicine people, and that if we try to train police officers to be all things to all people and be completely trained up in mental health and a wide variety of other things, and not recognize that in the future, there are going to be more teams in communities to de-escalate a situation or to deal with the everyday occurrences that arise out of homelessness or other things. So how can we think about training so that it doesn't become the be-all and end-all of solving every social problem or every controversy?
So again, that goes back to my points of the great, I wrote down the book. I'm going to definitely look at that, but great focus of questions here in what I'm looking at this in a way where sometimes people get trained and have a false sense of expertise. And I believe that when we transition into the education mindset of a career-long learning mindset, we're understanding also that officers are asked to do so much or respond to so many critical incidents where I believe we need to focus the attention of law enforcement education on how to de-escalate situations, understanding that I might not be the right person to talk to you for long terms. I am not a psychologist. When I was doing my research and doing the policies for our juvenile diversion program in the city down in LA, you look at, well, I want to do a systematic decision-making process to ensure everyone is treated equally and fairly. And so if we can do that knowing, hey, I don't know what I don't know, so I'm going to treat you fairly. I'm going to look at you as a human. I want you to understand that we will get you to the people who will help you. But if we train people to believe you are a mental health expert and you think this is the right way, you kind of put yourself in a position where, all right, I don't know where I'm at right now and what's going on. I believe we need to further or transition it into, we are going to give you an education in how to help people get to the point where they're going to be handed off to the teams, or allow those teams to come in and provide the expertise. So I don't know if I'm exactly clearly synthesizing my thoughts here, but I love that topic, and I love because I believe it is sometimes training. You're going to have this training, and this is how you're going to do it, and this is only way you can do it, versus creating an environment of having educated officers who are creative and smart in their approach to all these situations that are always different, because you're going to deal with people differently out in the community, from socioeconomic to wherever their rage is coming from or their trigger points are. You have to deal with them differently, where they want to be dealt with, not so much what the training has told you you have to deal with them. Mm-hmm. So if you give them that education about that, I have a belief that that would transition us into having smarter, more creative officers in the field that can find a resolution that is not, well, this is what training says will happen. If this doesn't happen, this goes to the next. Again, mm-hmm. We have an incredible amounts of smart, curious officers in the field. We need to now hone that into, well, we're going to educate you and give you this as a philosophy and as a culture shift. And I think that would help us going forward, versus we're going to drop 8 hours additional training mental health from a mental health expert, and versus having that go through your entire career, where yes, this pattern goes through your entire career.
Thank you. Commissioner Ioner?
Thank you. So I'm having a little hard time, because I guess in my head, I sometimes think that training and education are, synonymous, and I'm getting the point that you do not believe they're synonymous. And so I would like you to help me understand how you differentiate training from education.
I can train you to ride a motorcycle, and I can train you to ride it well, but I cannot, if I don't give you an education of how to look out for danger signs in the road, that I can't really put into training. I am not going to put a pothole in front of you or whatever it is. I want to train you to use a firearm, but I need to educate you on various other aspects of when and how to use that firearm. So I find a difference in training a task versus educating you on how to use that task, or when it's appropriate to use that task.
And you don't think that, and I'm just questioning here because I don't know how this works. You don't think that in a post-training, let's say about on how to use a gun, that broader conversation doesn't take place about when it's appropriate and when it's not, and how you might handle this situation versus that situation?
No, and thank you for allowing me to clarify. I think that what we are doing is great in the fact that we have training that is educating some, in those aspects of that very narrow focused, police training of tactics. However, there are so many other issues that come up that also need to be interjected into that education piece. Because when we're talking about procedural justice, we're talking about other aspects of training that need to be interjected into the education of, okay, we've trained you. And again, this goes from like having an associate's degree to having a doctorate. You train and you give this level of training, and you're talking about this education piece that's going into when you should, when you shouldn't, how it would affect others. And you start building upon that. And that's the educational track that I'm looking into versus we're going to train you to do this. We're then going to train you to do this. And then we're going to train you to do this versus we're going to incorporate the base understanding, kind of the basic training of how it is, the basic education. And from that basic training, we're going to start our educational track of building upon the layers, the sheetrock versus just a giving a full grant. Like you're actually building upon and educating people on the different aspects of not only firearms training, but now the procedural justice, that the basic level should be incorporated, that so when they start going through their career and they get additional information or additional education on procedural justice or diversity training or wherever we're looking at, it's building upon and it's at a level that the officer is then being able to understand and apply real time in the field. If that's, I hope I'm synthesizing my statements.
Well, kind of analogous to me to that is that very often you'll hear people say, I want to have a liberal arts education, and then after I have my liberal arts education, then I can decide on the profession and I will have appreciated everything there, and now I'm going to go to professional school to do whatever. I kind of hear you that way.
In a way, I have not looked in that scope, but I'm totally understanding what you're saying. But yes, I believe that what Mr. Alvarez has talked about at the beginning, and that I was really excited to hear, some of a small pinch of his personal beliefs of what it is to train or educate a peace officer. Yes, we have training, and if you want to, it could be synonymous in the ways, but when I look at us transitioning of how we look at a life learner or a career learner, if you're just saying we're going to train you, it's very choppy to me versus going from where their needs are and driving it through into ultimately having, very senior officers who can have gone through the track at a point where they needed it. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Let me call on Commissioner Schramberger, and Senator Nielsen indicated he wanted to speak, but I don't see him on the screen. So please, Commissioner Schramberger, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cortez. This is very informative. I like that we're building on the training versus education theme. And something caught my eye in your written testimony about how peace officers can earn certificates, not degrees, and that language can be somewhat of a barrier to legitimacy and trust in the community. And I wondered if there were some sort of a framework where there was the basic training, but there were these opportunities for advancing education over the life cycle. Could that be recognized in some way? Like, and this maybe is going way too far, but something along the lines of, you have your basic certificate from your basic training, and when and if you complete these things, there is this advanced certification or something that would encourage and recognize that sort of lifelong learning that kind of gets to this deeper educational approach.
So I love that you brought that up. And when I found out that Mr. Alvarez was going to be on this with me, I cut a bunch of stuff out of my written testimony because it goes through the requirements of getting your basic post. California, again, is far from like the horrible training. They've really put a lot of time and effort. I'm really proud of what you look at when you start looking deeper into what Post has done, what our elected officials have done and staff workers have done. It's great. We do have steps to get your basic post, and you can earn that quicker and they take into account you have 42 units of college. And you remember people who go through the training academy associated with community college come out with roughly about 25 units. That's just over a quarter of what it takes to get an associate's degree, and which is great. But there are so many opportunities with, again, the synchronous and asynchronous colleges that you can do online, or so if there's a way to build that further, that's where you start the encouragement of, okay, well, we're going to require, and again, this is not in my lane, but it's in my thought process. Again, all these opinions of my own is saying, to get your basic certificate, you shall have an associate's degree at least, or to get your intermediate, you shall have your bachelor's. And there's a lot of different formal education, which that is going into what I didn't really want to just throw onto my written work, because I actually had about 9 pages to send you, and I quickly realized that you're not going to want to read all 9 pages. What I want to discuss about this is when you start doing those requirements, not like suggestions, those requirements, that is going to push the officers out into some community. Hopefully it is at a local university or a remote learning where you can talk like we're talking now, so they can get those outside perspectives. And that is taking them onto that journey of learning or educating themselves. And so when they apply what they're being educated by post or required by post, accompanied by the requirements of the university, you're starting to get a good mesh of life or career learners. Because to get a master's and get your advanced, if it's required, I think that is something that would really encourage us and our officers to be those educated officers. And so if you are going and the public knows, well, that's a master or that's an intermediate based post, oh, well, they have to have a degree. I get that. And I think that could be something that aligns us with sort of what, when I read the bill about requiring a degree, it really got me to a point where I just didn't like how it was not providing access to our community members who aren't coming from the same backgrounds. And that is something we really need to go look into. And what Mr. Varner was saying about how do we get going back to our appeals, the police are the people are police, or the community, and really getting that dynamic of all of us coming together. If I went to the police department into this career, I would be able to be taught and learn and grow through this process and get a degree. I think that would be something that shows people it's not just a career that you're a gumshoe, you walk the beat all the time. No, we're actually providing a pathway for education to get our officers as educated as we can. Because again, I'm not saying education clears and gets everything perfect. I'm saying that it just sparks the conversations with members of the public who are not police personnel.
Got it. Yep, very good. Thank you. Now let me see, Senator Nielsen, are you here? Did you have something that you wanted to? I don't see any activity in that window. Okay. All right. Let me turn back then to the fellow commissioners. Do you have any? And I indicated, Dr. Cortez has been very generous with time, but he does have somewhere else to be. So anyone else have any questions or comments for Dr. Cortez? Seeing,
Well,
there you go, Bill. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll be following up with Manny Alvarez. We put these various requirements in. We don't always know what the best way is to do it. And I'm hoping he will give us guidance and we can be more clear and more concise in our use of funds. And Mr. Cortez, what I've asked Manny Alvarez to do is to get back to us to very much let us know when we have required things, if requiring them in the right way at the right time. He said some of the things that are done in the academy should be done later. So we just want to make sure that when we've directed posts to do it, we've directed in the right way. And I believe I will ask the Little Hoover Commission to alert me. And if you have suggestions along those lines, we'd be glad to hear them. I'll be talking with the Chair of Public Safety in the Assembly, and we'll try and do something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kirk. I really appreciate being here. I love the fact that this commission is taking on this topic because sometimes good idea fairies just come out of nowhere and try to throw everything in. You're taking a holistic approach, and I really appreciate that.
Great. Well, I will see you all later.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Cortez. And you did mention you had pages that you can submit, and I'm sure that our staff would be more than happy to receive those. And that can also be some information that we share with either commissioners who are interested, and I'm convinced that Assemblymember Cork would also like to see those.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your generosity and for helping us to get a different kind of perspective on the directions that we might take. Thank you again. So I believe that concludes testimony from our witnesses, unless something else has happened, which means that this would be time for public comment. Is that correct, Mr. Garrick?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. We'll now move into public comment, and for members of the public who are on the call, you may use the raised hand function in Zoom to indicate that you wish to make public comment, as you can see on your screen, or you can send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. As the chairman mentioned earlier, our public comment is traditionally limited to 3 minutes, so please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Commissioners will be able to hear you, but will not be able to see you while you're making public comment. While we wait to see if anyone raises their hand or emails us, I might mention for the benefit of the commissioners and members of the public that we will have 2 more hearings on this topic, February 25th, 2 weeks from today, when we expect to hear from both reform advocates, law enforcement reform advocates, and from law enforcement officials on the topic of additional training. And then on March 11th, our hearing will focus on lessons from other states on law enforcement training. So we will be hearing additional voices, Mr. Chairman, on this topic. So again, for members of the public, use the raise hand function or email us littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes. And if you email us, as you can see on the screen, it's important that you include your name and the phone number from which you have joined the meeting. That will tell the staff who to unmute when you are called on. So that's very important, actually, if you email us. And at this time, I'll ask Ashley to let us know if anyone, any members of the public have raised their hand.
Yes, we do have a public comment starting with Steve McNally. Steve, I'm turning on your ability to speak.
Go ahead, Mr. McNally.
Now you're muted.
Ashley, is that, have we unmuted Mr. McNally?
Oh, I
yes.
see. I had to unmute myself. My apologies.
There you go. Mr. McNally, please go ahead.
My name's Steve McNally, and I reside in Orange County, California. I don't have a lot of experience with criminal justice or law enforcement, with the exception of understanding collaborative courts for mental health. We spent a lot of time in hospitals in our mental health journey. So I want to just play off some of the comments. What I appreciate is all the open, informative comments. I don't always get that when I'm with the Department of Healthcare Services. There's a prevailing theme across agencies in California that nobody should be looked bad. You know, it's very difficult to find information on a local level. So first, you cannot legislate culture. You can't legislate openness and willingness to actually be the community police force that you're hoping for. And I would suggest that most of the police force probably is that police force, but we don't hear about it. First thing I did with all those tragedies was I just went to the FBI UCR database and looked up exactly what the details are. So very few people ever get the details, unfortunately. I like that idea about remote training outside of the law enforcement agency, because that allows people that are open to this, but they're stuck in departments that are not open to it, to be around like-minded people. And I think that's the big opportunity in California, is to connect the like-minded people from the state to the local boards and commissions. There's a disconnect and we're not all working together. There is one big idea that he had mentioned about getting community interactions and the law enforcement in the same room. And one opportunity there is mental health training uses a video, which is all based on scenarios where you de-escalate, and it's a perfect environment for a sheriff or a police chief to host or co-host with the healthcare agencies a community forum, because we have to train the community how to interact with the police. In Los Angeles, the dispatcher has a trained police officer next to them, and they're pulling together all the information. So when the officer goes to the house, they know exactly, is there any issues with security, or talk to the family first. And families need to be able to give the information, because they have a false expectation if they come on a crisis call to their house, that something's going to happen. And lastly, it's difficult because as just people, nobody ever tells us. It's very hard to find out what you're doing. I happen to be on a lot of e-list, but now I know 3 people today that presented. I know that they're straightforward, informative, and they're not defensive. And it might be helpful to create the links of where to find all this information to make it easier to inform others, so they'll be better advocates for what you're trying to do. It's very isolating when you're in a community and nobody seems to want to talk to you. You know, it's very difficult to get to public elected officials, and it's very difficult to just have communication, not presentations. So when today, when you broke into more of a Q&A, you got a lot more done. And what I find is when we can do that, we're really all not that far apart. But a lot of times, the agencies are more apt to want to present at rather than to do dialogue. And then also the Mental Health Service
Mr. McNally, you're a bit over your 3 minutes. If you can
Oh,
wrap
I'm
up,
sorry.
please.
I wasn't counting. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Have
sir.
a great day, guys.
You bet.
Thank
Thank you.
Ashley,
Mr.
do we have other?
Mr. Chairman, Jim Nielsen, can I check in, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
I apologize to you and my colleagues, but I have to depart for the legislature. So thank you very much. This was very, very instructive. Let me just close with a concern not applicable to the content of our hearing today, but a lot of the law enforcement professionals on the walk, and I'm talking to them literally every day, they're very concerned with the trend of time right now, which is so highly critical of them, not about their own careers as much as how are we going to recruit for the future. Just kind of put that away as a concern that I think is looming. And I thank you, and my apologies for having to depart.
Thank you for participating. It's always good to see you.
Ashley, do we have other people who have indicated a desire to make public comment?
No, we have no additional requests for public comment on Zoom or email.
Okay, then.
Very good. Well, now, again, let me express my gratitude to staff. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of digging to find people who, you know, can contribute in a meaningful way. And I think that what we received today was certainly education for me with respect to POST. I mean, I'd heard of it, wasn't quite sure what they did and how they did it, and the extent and their reach and some of the challenges that they face. And I was encouraged as we heard from witnesses, that California is, far and ahead of many other states as it relates to training, identifying areas of training and how to deliver it. I think we're going to be able to make a contribution with respect to this topic because of the commissioner's interest and their perspectives. And so before we adjourn, let me just open it up to commissioners. If you have any comments that you want to offer now in terms of possible direction for staff. Ethan has told us who we're going, essentially the subject area of what we're going to cover on the 25th of February. But if there's any staff members, not staff, I'm sorry, commissioners who have any closing comments, we certainly welcome those. Not seeing any, I want to express again appreciation to the commissioners for your dedication and for participating. And we'll see you on the 25th.
Excellent. Great meeting. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah, thank you.